This is Dr. Rick Kellerman, and I'll moderate this session of FP Audio. Our topic is the calorie myth. Our speaker is Dr. Sean Lucan. Dr. Lucan is an associate professor in the Department of Family and Social Medicine at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City. Dr. Lucan has had a number of National Institutes of Health grants and has focused his research on obesity and chronic disease and how our social environment affects the food we eat. He has co-authored a textbook and numerous peer-reviewed journal articles on nutrition and health-related behavior. Thank you for joining us, Sean.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, there are actually several subcomponents of this calorie myth. Let's just start with the first one, and that is the 3,500 calorie myth. In other words, 3,500 calories equals 1 pound.
So this is a persistent myth and one that's been perpetuated by physicians, is accepted by patients, and just kind of understood in the general public, and yet is very inaccurate and I think can set patients up for disappointment and for failure. So the idea is that 3,500 calories equals 1 pound of body weight or body fat, and that by burning 3,500 calories more than you take in, that you can shed 1 pound of body fat or 1 pound of body weight. So patients may ask how many fewer calories they need to eat or how many more calories they need to burn to lose weight. And the prevailing view is that if they can burn 3,500 calories more than they take in, they're going to lose 1 pound of body weight or hopefully body fat. And that works out nicely by the math, 500 calories a day over a 7-day course or over a week, such that if you can just under-consume 500 calories on a daily basis for 1 week, you will lose 1 pound of body weight. The problem is that this 3,500 calorie rule ignores dynamic nonlinear response to body weight and sustained changes to calorie balance. When individuals lose weight, compensatory mechanisms kick in and work to prevent weight loss. In fact, there was a lot of attention given to a study of the Biggest Loser participants, where most of the competitors not only wound up regaining weight, but sometimes exceeded their initial starting weight. And what was shown was that their body really fought to regain weight. These biological mechanisms were put in place, and basically their metabolisms were angry at the fact that they had lost this weight and were trying to reestablish the weight that was familiar to them. And so when people lose weight, it doesn't happen in a linear direction along a straight line. It happens in a curved linear pattern. And so while there's often good weight loss early on, that becomes increasingly challenged as time passes and things tend to plateau. So an example I like to give to demonstrate the problem with this rationale is that if you take a 200-pound person, you have them under-consume calories, 500 a day for 7 days, and that's a pound a week. And over the course of a year, they would lose 50 pounds. But that 200-pound person is not simply going to disappear after 4 years if they're able to maintain that calorie deficit, right? And so the body follows a linear pattern for some time, but then shortly after that levels out and weight loss becomes much less substantial.
Well, and I agree, and I think physicians have always had some cognitive dissonance about this 3,500 calories equals 1 pound of fat. We all took physics and math, and it sounds very precise that 3,500 calories equals 1 pound. Yet in practice, we all know that that just doesn't happen. And I think you've made the point that there are these biologic compensatory mechanisms, and we know that they exist when we're trying to help people lose weight. The math just doesn't work.
Yeah, and so 500 calories is actually over a daily basis a lot to maintain, but let's take something a little more modest. Let's just assume patients are under consuming 100 net calories a day. So that's about the equivalent of a single banana. By the 3,500 calorie rule, people under consuming a single banana a day would lose more than 50 pounds over 5 years. So if we could just motivate patients to eat one less banana a day, we could help them succeed in losing a substantial amount of weight. But when you look at actual physiologic compensation, a much more realistic figure with under consuming about a banana a day is about 10 pounds over 5 years. And most of that weight will be lost right up front in the first year, or about 50% of that weight. So 5 pounds will come off in year 1. It'll take about 3 years to lose 95% of that weight. And then in the last 2 years, despite the continued effort, despite the same adherence, despite religiously not eating that extra banana a day, patients might only lose about 0.5 pound. You're really working against strong biological forces here, and you really start to plateau out quickly. And you really get into a situation where if you set the expectation of this kind of linear weight loss, you're going to set patients up for disappointment and failure.
Well, that leads right into the second myth, and that is the myth that we can even count calories.
Counting calories in and of itself is an implausible feat. Think about what it would require to account for your actual calorie intake. So not just what you ingest, not just what you put into your mouth, but what you actually absorb from your food. And think about what it would take to understand your actual calorie expenditure. So not just in exercise, but in all the various fluctuating metabolic processes and reactions that are occurring throughout your body on a daily basis. And think what it would take to do so with sufficient accuracy and precision to maintain any kind of real-time calorie balance sheet in order to guide behavior as to how much more exercise you should be doing or how much less you should be eating. And it becomes a highly improbable, implausible task. So not only is it implausible, but it doesn't even really make sense. When you think about it, calorie intake and calorie expenditure are coupled. They're physiologically linked. They are paired. One is tied to the other. And you can recognize this in your everyday life. Think about a time when you might have exerted yourself more than you otherwise would have. Maybe you did an especially hard workout. Were you hungrier after that? Did you wind up eating more than you otherwise would have to compensate? Or think about a time when you tried to eat less than your body needed. Did you feel fatigued? Did you feel disinclined to activity? These things are kind of inescapable physiologic facts that calories in and calories out tend to be linked. So in order to make progress, we need to begin to uncouple this association. And the way we do that is by the food choices that we make.
Well, I think one of the other precise mathematical formulas that doesn't really work in real practice is the idea that fats are 9 kilocalories per gram versus carbohydrates and proteins that are both 4 kilocalories per gram. And how does that relate to the calories in, calories out equation?
Well, first I should note that a calorie is not a calorie. Yes, a calorie is a unit of energy, and 1 unit of energy is 1 unit of energy, just like 1 unit of anything is 1 unit of the same anything. But that's not to say that different foods with the same number of calories, with the same energies, have the same biological effects. So different calories may have different effects based on the types of calories that they contain. That is their composition of calorie-providing fats, carbohydrates, proteins, or alcohol. So different foods may have different effects on pathways involved in appetite versus satiety, energy burning versus energy storage. So a focus on calories almost inevitably becomes a focus on dietary fat. So dietary fat being the food component with by far the greatest calorie density of any of the other food components. So reducing calories usually means reducing dietary fat, or more often replacing dietary fat with something of lower calories, which is generally carbohydrates or refined carbohydrates like starches and sugars. But higher calorie, fattier foods are not necessarily bad. For example, nuts and olive oil and oily fish, avocados. And lower calorie foods, lower fat foods are not necessarily good. Foods like highly refined, ultra-processed, sugary and starchy items.
So the issue is not just the calories in the food, it's how our biologic system responds to that and the neurohormonal responses of our system to the particular food.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The predominant model is that if we just have enough willpower, if we just have the self-control and self-discipline and move more and eat less, we will have healthier weights and better health, avoid obesity, and all will be well. But I think a more nuanced way of thinking about it looks more at the types of calories that we're eating rather than the absolute quantity. Particularly, it's the intake of rapidly absorbable carbohydrates, added sugars, and refined starches that tend to be the problem here. So these are the calories that tend to reinforce overeating, that tend to drive appetites, particularly appetites for more starchy and sugary foods, and tend to lead to disruption in neurohormonal pathways that cause us to be obese or induce obesity on a metabolic level. Just to give an example of more nuanced thinking, let's take an example where we look at two snacks that are of the same size or the same amount. So we'll look at a handful of walnuts versus a piece of cake. And so each of these snacks is going to be 100 grams. But the walnuts, being a high-fat food, are going to have about twice the number of calories as the piece of cake, as the refined piece of sugary cake. And being a high-fat food, they're going to have almost 5 times the amount of fat as in that piece of cake. And it wouldn't be hard to imagine how the food processing industry could develop a low-fat version of their cake with even less fat and even more sugar in it, making an even more marked distinction in terms of the proportion of sugar between the two. So the question is, would a higher calorie, higher fat snack like a handful of walnuts be the less healthy choice here? Would that be the snack you wouldn't want to choose if you were looking for healthier weight and better health? And I hope it's clear to everyone that that is preposterous, right? So whole foods like nuts, like walnuts in particular, are filling. They induce satiety. They keep our overall calorie intake for the day lower. And they also promote healthier metabolism and overall better health. And that's regardless of the calories and maybe even because of the fat they contain. Conversely, refined and processed products like the white cake drive hunger and compel us to eat more. So they actually program us to overeat and to overeat the wrong kind of foods, more starchy and sugary items that tend to make us fatter and sicker. They promote obesity and diseases like diabetes. And while it's really hard to overeat walnuts, it's really easy to have a second or even third piece of cake and then to crave some soda or chips to go along with it.
So, Sean, you've kind of had a motto of plants, not plants. In other words, we should eat biological plants, not foods that come from an industrial plant or are overprocessed.
I always say we should be eating foods from living botanical plants, not industrial processing plants. And so another example that I could give is what I've called a tale of two salads. We'll start with a base of lettuce in each. One salad will throw in some food from living botanical plants. So we'll put in some sunflower seeds, maybe some avocado, and maybe drizzle it generously with some pure olive oil. So all foods from plants, all healthy whole foods. On the other salad, maybe we'll put in some white bread croutons, we'll put in some highly sugared fruit chews, and maybe like a syrupy, fat-free dressing. So these are foods that are ultra-processed products of industry. Now, they're lower calorie, there's no question. And in fact, the processed food salad will have substantially lower calories than the higher calorie whole food salad. But that said, real whole foods are more satiating. They better control appetite and they wind up producing less subsequent eating. Even though the index salad may have more calories, when you look at overall calories for the day, they may functionally have fewer calories because they induce less overeating. And moreover, it's real whole food that is good for us, as opposed to these processed products that are full of refined starches and sugars that tend to make our metabolism go crazy and get us to overeat and put us on a path towards ill health.
So, Sean, as I was preparing for this interview with you, and I've heard you speak before, and I was doing some of the background reading, I decided to do my own little experiment, an N of 1. And what I did was I changed my dietary habits. As I was eating something, I didn't focus on calories or anything like that, but rather simply asked myself the question, is this a processed food? And if it was, I didn't eat it or tried not to eat it, and rather tried to eat unprocessed foods. So the specific question that came up was rice. White rice is a processed food.
Well, I think kind of comparing and contrasting the two ways of thinking about this. So there's calorie-focused thinking, which is concerned first and foremost about calories and tends to, as a result, be concerned about foods that are high in fat because fat has the greatest number of calories. So foods that are lower in fat or lower in calories are desirable, whereas by more nuanced thinking, it's less about the calories per se and more about the type of calories. And the biggest problem is the refined starches, simple sugars, and added sugars. So in the case of rice, or white rice rather, would be a food that would be encouraged or would be promoted by calorie-focused thinking, right? So white rice is a low-fat food that people that subscribe to calorie-focused thinking wouldn't have a problem with. Whereas from a more nuanced kind of thinking, white rice is functionally just starch, which is metabolically equivalent to sugar. And so eating a bowl of white rice is detrimental. It's something that has metabolic consequences and would tend to move us on a path towards greater appetite, continued eating, unhealthy metabolic changes, and being more prone to developing obesity. Now, that said, it's not that rice in and of itself is a problem. So certainly brown rice or whole rice would be a much better choice. So white rice is a refined grain. It's essentially just isolated starch. Brown rice still has the fiber and the protein and the vitamins and the minerals and is a whole food. And that gets back to the point about foods from living botanical plants like brown rice, the foods from industrial processing plants like white rice. So the more that you can try to choose foods in a form that is as close to what occurs in nature as possible, I think we overall do better and would wind up being healthier from a weight and metabolic and overall wellness standpoint.
Well, the second food was potatoes, and I'm talking about baked potatoes, not French fries or anything like that. It's natural. I didn't put anything on them, but I've always heard about the high glycemic index of potatoes. How do we counsel patients about potatoes and their calorie impact?
The evidence on potatoes is kind of mixed. Some studies suggest that potatoes can actually be quite filling, but mostly they are just isolated starch. But there's some other good stuff in there. And it's the vegetable that is the most consumed among all Americans. I think, as with the example of the rice, which I didn't mention, an important consideration is not just the single food item itself, but what it's being eaten with. So an occasional potato every now and then is not a bad thing, especially if it's being eaten in the context of a meal that contains other components like other vegetables, potentially some other protein or some fats, or some other things that might help buffer the sugar load that comes from that starch component. The other thing is maybe substituting some other vegetables or starches for the potato, like some whole grain products, lentils, beans, nuts, or other foods that come from plants.
Well, and then the third food that I had a question about was yogurt and cheese.
So yogurt's an interesting food because the predominant varieties that are found in supermarkets are highly sweetened. And so yogurt almost becomes synonymous with candy or some type of highly sugared product. I don't have any problem with unsweetened yogurt. And in fact, when you think about a sugar-sweetened full-fat yogurt, there are kind of two ways that you could do a yogurt makeover and make that yogurt healthier. One camp would say, subtract out the fat. Another camp would say, take out the sugar, make it unsweetened. By a calorie-focused paradigm, the idea would be to take a sugary full-fat yogurt and take the fat out, and somehow that would be healthier. I would say that that would actually probably be less healthy because there'd be less fat in the mix, kind of slowing the absorption of that sugary meal. Whereas if you take the sugared full-fat yogurt and subtract out the sugar, you're left with just unsweetened full-fat yogurt, which is how nature made it. So that's the whole food in its unprocessed form. And most of the studies that have looked at dairy in general, but yogurt particularly, have showed beneficial effects with regard to weight and also with regard to other cardiometabolic health outcomes. The same could be said for cheese.
Well, the philosophy that we have in the United States that's a little bit off base is that we have a focus on weight, not particularly health.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, as a society, we're so keyed into weight, which isn't really the issue and isn't even really representative of what weight is often used to represent, which is body fatness or adiposity. I should note that obesity is not a quantitative problem of pounds on a scale. Obesity is a qualitative problem of altered body metabolism. There are certainly people that are overweight or that are obese by weight-related metrics like the BMI who are metabolically quite healthy. Conversely, there are people that have a normal BMI or normal weight, which are kind of metabolic disasters. I think even in terms of how we look at obesity, I think the scale is not the way to do that. We know that central obesity, or carrying fat around our midsection, is what tends to be most important. So that's certainly correlated with higher mortality than weight-defined obesity and is likely more representative of overall health. So I think more important than pounds on a scale is how fat is distributed on our bodies. And so certainly when fat is around our midsections, that's much more of a problem. And so it's really more about shape than it is weight. And having more of an apple body type where there's a concentration of fat around the waistline or around the midsection is certainly a problem. And I think we want to be focusing more on overall health than on numbers on the scale.
Well, Sean, I think you really have made the point that we need to focus on health, not just weight, and that we need to focus on eating nutritious foods, not just counting calories. Do you have any final comments?
I think healthy eating is about overall food quality. It's not about food calories. And so calories absolutely count. They matter, but I don't think that patients should be counting them. I think that that's a counterproductive activity that leads to frustration and is not productive. I think patients should be choosing foods that allow for unconscious control of calories. They should be enjoying whole foods from nature, irrespective of their calorie or fat content. I think choosing foods from living botanical plants as opposed to industrial processing plants can be a guiding principle and can keep people on a path towards doing better in terms of their overall health goals.
Well, thank you, Sean, for joining us on FP Audio. This has been a very interesting presentation, some provocative thoughts, and makes us think about how we should be approaching patients and how in our own lives we need to be thinking about health. Thank you for joining us on FP Audio.
Hey, thanks so much, Rick.